To the public, it was a marvel. 600 tons of steam-driven power stretching longer than a city block, conquering the Rockies as the pride of American industry. But inside the big boy's cab, three-man crews faced searing heat, deafening noise, and the constant threat of a 300 pounds per square inch boiler that could kill them in seconds. On April 27, 1953, those dangers became horrifyingly real for engineer Leo Murray and his team. They were not the first nor the last men sacrificed so freight could move faster. Why did railroads gamble with so many lives for glory and tonnage? And what was the true cost for the families left behind? The story begins long before the wreck. In the years after World War II, the United States saw itself as a nation without limits. Factories churned out steel, highways stretched across deserts, and the word impossible seemed to vanish from the American vocabulary. In this climate, bigger was always better. Across the country, industries competed to build the largest refineries, the tallest smokestacks, and the fastest assembly lines. Railroads, too, joined this contest of scale, racing to prove their dominance with ever more powerful machines. The Union Pacific, with its vast Western empire, became obsessed with conquering the mountains that had once slowed its trains to a crawl. The thinking was simple. If a 10-wheeled locomotive could pull a mile of freight cars, surely a 20-wheeled giant could pull two. The men at the top believed that the answer to every problem was more steel, more horsepower, more tonnage behind a single engine. They spoke of progress as if it were measured in feet and tons, not in the lives of the men who made it possible. This was an age of industrial appetite, when the scale of a machine became a symbol of national pride. Newspapers ran photos of men standing in the shadows of towering locomotives, dwarfed by drive wheels taller than a man's head. Union Pacific's publicity department called their new engines the mightiest ever built, and the public cheered the spectacle. But the men who actually ran these machines, the engineers, the firemen, the brakemen, knew that every increase in size brought new hazards. Inside the cab, there was no room for myth. The heat from the firebox could blister skin. The noise pressed against the skull until even the strongest men grew numb. Every shift was a test of endurance, and every mile through the mountains was a gamble. Yet the pressure to haul more freight, to keep the trains moving at all costs, never let up. Managers in distant offices set ever higher targets, convinced that a bigger engine meant a safer, more efficient railroad. In reality, the scale of these machines demanded more from their crews than any calculation could capture. Every run was a demonstration of strength, but not just of metal and steam. It was the strength of men who risked everything to keep America's freight moving, even as the cost grew with every mile. The mountains ahead were not just a challenge of engineering, they were a test of how far the nation would go in pursuit of size, and how many would pay the price along the way. A single glance at the big boy in profile tells you everything about America's ambition in steel. The locomotive stretched nearly 133 feet from coupler to coupler, longer than a blue whale and heavier than a loaded 747. When fully fueled and watered, the engine and its tender tipped the scales at over 600 tons. That mass rested on a wheel arrangement as complex as a machine shop, a 4884 configuration, meaning 2 sets of 8 driving wheels, each anchored by 4-wheel trucks at the front and rear. This articulation let the big boy bend around mountain curves that would have derailed a rigid frame. But for the men on board, the sheer size was not just a marvel. It was a daily burden. Inside the cab, 3 men were responsible for keeping the monster alive and moving. The engineer, the fireman, and the head-end brakeman formed the minimum crew allowed by rule. Each shift, they faced a machine that burned through resources at a pace few could comprehend. At full throttle, the big boy devoured 11 tons of coal and 12,000 gallons of water every hour. That meant the fireman was locked in a relentless battle with the firebox, shoveling or stoking coal into a roaring furnace that could melt steel. The tender behind them carried up to 28 tons of coal and 25,000 gallons of water. But even that reserve could vanish in a matter of hours when climbing the Wasatch or Sherman Hill grades. Every control in the cab was oversized, built to manage the forces at play. The throttle lever spanned nearly 3 feet, requiring the engineer to lean in with his whole body. Gauges for boiler pressure and water level were set in thick steel panels, their needles quivering as the engine strained against gravity. The Westinghouse air brake system, meant to stop thousands of tons in motion, demanded constant vigilance. A moment's inattention could mean runaway cars or worse. The workload was relentless. The fireman's arms and back ached from feeding the beast. The engineer's eyes stung from coal dust and cinders. The brakeman, always alert for signals and ready to jump down at a siding, risked frostbite in winter and heat exhaustion in summer. There was no air conditioning, no insulation from the noise or the heat. Cab temperatures soared past 120 degrees, and the roar of the boiler and exhaust made conversation an effort. On paper, the big boy was a marvel of modern engineering, a symbol of progress and power. In reality, it was a machine that demanded as much from its crew as it did from its fuel. Every hour on the line was measured not just in miles, but in sweat and risk. The big boy's scale was more than a number. It was a weight that pressed down on the men who kept it moving, mile after mile, through the heart of the American West. 300 pounds per square inch. That was the normal working pressure inside the big boy's boiler, a figure that sounds abstract until you imagine it pressing against every inch of steel, straining for release. The cab was separated from disaster by little more than an inch-thick barrier of alloyed steel. If that wall failed, the result wasn't a gentle leak. It was an explosion of flash steam, hotter than a blast furnace, expanding with the force of dynamite. In an instant, a ruptured boiler could turn the cab into a death trap, hurling steel and scalding vapor at anything in its path. The lethal radius wasn't measured in feet, but in yards. On smaller locomotives, a boiler explosion could tear apart a roundhouse. On a big boy, the consequences would be even more violent. Federal records from the Interstate Commerce Commission tallied dozens of such incidents across the steam era, each one a grim lesson in physics. The pressure gauge in the big boy's cab was a constant reminder, a quivering needle marking the difference between controlled power and catastrophic failure. For the crew, every shift meant trusting that thousands of stay bolts and rivets, each one stressed to its limit, would hold. They watched water levels and pressure readings with the vigilance of men who knew what was at stake. A missed signal, a faulty weld, or a hidden crack could unleash the stored energy of a small bomb right where they sat. No passenger ever died from a big boy boiler failure. The men in the cab, though, lived with the knowledge that any mechanical flaw, however small, would claim them first. In the world of high-pressure steam, the machine's appetite for power came with a price paid in flesh and bone. For the railroad, the risk was calculated, acceptable losses measured against the tonnage moved over the mountains. For the men at the controls, it was a reality as close as the next turn of the wheel. Each shift inside the big boy's cab began with the hiss of steam and the ache of muscle. The fireman, often just a young man with calloused hands, faced a mountain of coal, sometimes 20 tons or more to move before the run was done. The stoker's rhythm never let up. Shovel, swing, feed the flames, again and again, hour after hour. Even with mechanical stokers, the work demanded constant attention, sweat pouring down faces as the firebox roared at their backs. The heat was merciless. On a long climb, cab temperatures soared beyond 120 degrees, hotter than many foundries. There was no relief from the furnace or the sun beating through the glass. The engineer wiped his brow with a sleeve blackened by coal dust, eyes fixed on quivering needles. Boiler pressure, water level, brake pipe, all demanding constant vigilance. The noise pressed in from every side, the blast of the exhaust, the rattle of steel, the relentless pounding of the wheels. Decibel levels in the cab could reach 110 or more, loud enough to drown out shouted warnings and leave ears ringing long after the shift ended. Fatigue was a constant companion. A single lapse, missing a gauge, misjudging a signal, could bring disaster in an instant. The cadence of the work left little room for rest. On a heavy grade, even a brief distraction could mean falling behind the fire or letting pressure drop, risking a stall or worse. Every man knew stories of crews who paid for a moment's inattention with their lives. The railroad's demands never softened. Schedules tightened, tonnage increased, and the men in the cab bore the cost in sweat, exhaustion, and sometimes blood. Big Boy's legend was built on the backs of its operators, men who learned to live with danger as a matter of routine. For every mile conquered, there was a price. One measured not just in coal and steel, but in the toll taken on those who kept the engine alive. April 27, 1953. The morning air over Red Desert Siding in Wyoming carried the distant thunder of Union Pacific's Big Boy, number 4005. A locomotive built to conquer mountains, but never immune to the smallest human error. At the front of the train, engineer Leo Glenn Murray, age 42, guided the 300-ton engine westbound, joined by fireman Lawrence Ed Endress and brakeman James R. Anderton. Their names would soon be etched into the records of railroad tragedy. The switch at Red Desert Siding should have been closed, guiding the freight safely along the main line. Instead, it was thrown open, whether by mistake or miscommunication. The record remains divided. Murray caught the danger too late. He reached for the emergency brake, but the Big Boy's immense weight and speed made stopping impossible. The locomotive lunged into the siding at nearly 50 miles per hour, wheels screaming as steel fought against steel. Instantly, the engine left the rails, rolled onto its side, and the tender crashed forward, crushing the cab. Murray and Endress died where they sat, their lives claimed in a matter of seconds. Anderton, pulled from the wreckage alive, suffered burns so severe he would not survive the week. The Interstate Commerce Commission investigation and coroner's notes would later confirm what the families already knew. 3 men paid for a single mistake with everything they had. For their widows and children, the cost of progress was measured in absence, a father's empty chair at the table, a husband's name carved in stone. In the roundhouses at Cheyenne and Ogden, the Big Boy's reputation for strength masked a daily reality of rushed repairs and mounting backlogs. Work orders for stay bolt replacements and critical inspections often sat waiting as the locomotives cycled through the shops, sometimes with only the most urgent fixes addressed before the next run. Shop foremen, pressed by headquarters to keep the engines moving, made hard choices, postponing non-essential maintenance so the Big Boys could haul another load over Sherman Hill. The numbers in Union Pacific's annual reports told the story. Every hour a locomotive spent in the shop meant lost revenue. Steam power cost the company 2.3 cents per mile in 1950 compared to 1.8 cents for the new diesels. But the Big Boy could pull heavier trains, and that meant fewer crews and fewer runs to meet the same freight targets. Deferred maintenance became a calculated risk. Boiler stay bolts, meant to be replaced on a strict schedule, sometimes ran beyond their service life. Parts shortages and supply chain delays only added to the strain. Mechanics worked double shifts during the post-war freight boom, but the volume of work always outpaced the available hands. Every decision to send a locomotive back on the road without a full overhaul was justified by the logic of tonnage. The company's focus stayed fixed on the bottom line, even as the risks to the men in the cab grew with every mile. For the crews, the knowledge that the machine beneath them might not have received every repair was just another burden. One more reminder that, for all the public glory, the big boy's true cost was paid in flesh and bone. The men who ran the big boy did not suffer in silence. In the months before the Red Desert wreck, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen took their case to the bargaining table. Union meeting minutes from 1952 and 1953 record a clear demand. Hazard, pay for crews assigned to articulated giants like the big boy. Recognition of the extraordinary physical demands and dangers written into every mile. Their resolution called for a minimum 3-man crew, stricter switch protocols, and compensation that matched the risks. The language was blunt. No euphemisms, no corporate gloss, just a record of what it meant to work inside a steel furnace rolling through the mountains. Railroad executives dismissed these warnings as the price of progress, but the dangers were not just stories told in union halls. Modern engineering simulations, run decades after the last big boy left the rails, confirm what the crews already knew. Under emergency braking, a 300-ton locomotive could decelerate at only 0.15 G, barely enough to slow the train before disaster. Stress maps of the boiler and frame reveal hot spots where fatigue cracks could start, invisible to the naked eye but deadly if left unchecked. The data, like the union's testimony, leaves little room for doubt. The big boy was a marvel built to the edge of what steel and flesh could endure. The men who worked her demanded to be heard, but the company's answer was always the same: keep the trains moving, no matter the cost. In the hours after the wreck, the quiet of Red Desert was shattered by the arrival of local firefighters, sheriff's deputies, and Union Pacific's own rescue teams. The overturned locomotive still hissed with escaping steam, forcing rescuers to wait before they could reach the cab. County records show the coroner's inquest began almost immediately, with the grim task of identifying remains and notifying families. News of the disaster spread quickly. Headlines in the Cheyenne Tribune and the Wyoming Tribune Echo told of 3 railroad men lost, their names and ages listed alongside stories of shattered equipment and scorched earth. At home, widows began preparing for funerals with little more than a telegram and a promise of modest survivor benefits. Children faced the sudden absence of a father who had left for work and never returned. The community gathered for memorial services, laying flowers at the crash site and filling church pews in towns along the line. For those left behind, the cost of the big boy was measured in lost futures and empty chairs at the dinner table. Union Pacific's publicity machine called the big boy the wonder of the West, splashing its image across magazine covers and posters in station waiting rooms. Brochures boasted of record-breaking tonnage and mountain grades conquered, while advertisements showed crews dwarfed by gleaming steel, invincible, anonymous, almost ornamental. The locomotive became a traveling billboard for American progress, its dangers scrubbed from public memory. In museum halls today, the big boy stands polished and silent, celebrated as a triumph of engineering. Plaques praise horsepower and length, but rarely mention the men lost to heat, pressure, and the relentless drive for efficiency. The stories of widows and fatherless children are missing from the official narrative. Public relations campaigns and museum displays have preserved the legend, the legend, but erased the cost. The big boy's image endures, heroic and untouchable, while the reality of what it demanded from its crews fades quietly into the background. The last big boy left active service in 1959, not because the dangers had been solved, but because diesel locomotives made the old giants uneconomical to keep running. Internal memos from Union Pacific's headquarters laid out the logic in plain terms. Diesel engines needed less maintenance, fewer men, and could be kept on the rails longer without the risk of catastrophic failure. Retirement rosters filled up as the steam fleet was pulled from the line, one by one, with no public reckoning for the lives lost or the warnings ignored. The decision to end the era of the big boy was made in boardrooms, driven by cost calculations and efficiency charts, not by any admission of the human cost. The men who had risked everything inside those cabs were left with memories, scars, and questions that would never be answered by a line in a ledger. For every headline hailing industrial triumph, there were families left waiting for fathers who would never return. Railroad companies knew the risks, yet chose profit over safety. Big Boy's legacy is written not just in steel, but in lives lost. Today, automation and efficiency still tempt industries to gamble with worker safety. The real cost of progress is measured in human lives. What price do we accept now?